Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you to this preparatory meeting in view of the upcoming Internet Governance Forum, which is taking place, as you know, in Poland next week. This meeting will bring together Internet governance experts to discuss how European stakeholders contributed so far to the process of the United Nations Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation and on how to make IGF more responsive to current digital issues. Today's debate is hosted by the EIF Steering Committee member, Marina Kaljurand, who's an MEP with the S&D Group and head of the European Parliament delegation to the IGF 2021. I would also add that Marina is an IGF veteran, indeed. Thank you so much, Marina, for taking the lead and agree to host this meeting today. And I will leave you the floor in a moment, of course. But before I do so, I would like to introduce our speakers, starting with Pearse O'Donoghue, who is Director for the Future Networks Directorate at DG Connect, European Commission. We're also joined by Sandra Hoferichter, Secretary General at EuroDIG, and by Yuping Chan, the Senior Program Officer at the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology at the United Nations. Last but not least, Maarit Palovirta, who is Senior Director for Regulatory Affairs at ETNO. Thank you very much for joining us today. And with no further ado, I will now give the floor to Marina Kaljurand, our hosting MEP, for her opening remarks, and we will then listen to other speakers.
Thank you, Maria Rosa, for your very kind introduction. And yes, I'm proud of being IGF veteran, strong supporter, and strong believer in IGF. And thank you for having this discussion today. Even before we started recording, we exchanged some last-minute information because many things are changing. There are still questions, how many people will go, how many people will not. So on behalf of the European Parliament delegation, I do not have full picture today, how many MEPs will go in person to Katowice, but we will be present. I will be going there, we will be present there, and our colleagues will be joining online because this time it's also going to be a physical and hybrid meeting. In my introductory remarks, I have to say also something on the substance of the IGF and IGF Plus. Because yes, I had the privilege of serving on the high-level panel for digital cooperation of the Secretary General. And we had meetings, we had really thorough discussions. And if I look back at 2019, 2020, when our high-level panel was working, I would underline that maybe the three most important things for me were, first, to repeat the main principles, including cybersecurity, including applicability of international law that were already agreed in other forums, but we reiterated on the level of the high-level panel. Second, it had very big emphasis on the multi-stakeholder model. Yes, I think that it took years before governments and before states fully recognized the importance and the importance of multi-stakeholder model. I've said it before that it's not in the DNA of governments to cooperate with other stakeholders because for many centuries, governments have been the ones deciding on security matters, on many matters, and now we have digital questions, now we have cybersecurity where governments alone can't do anything because private sector owns critical infra, private sector is providing online services, civil society is there, academia is there, IT experts are there. So there is a changing moment. And for years now we were saying the right things politically. So politically we were using the right words when talking about multi-stakeholder model, about inclusiveness, about free and open, affordable, accessible and secure internet. But in practical terms, I would argue that we're still not completely there. So that's why for me it was very important that the high-level panel underlined the importance of the multi-stakeholder model, or we can call inclusiveness, whatever word we like. And the third most important point for me was the future of the internet discussions. We did not have time to go into many details because we had limited time resources. But in the end, we came up with 3 scenarios for the future of the internet discussions. And the first one, and for me, the most important one, was the IGF+. And I will just briefly, if I may, I'll just briefly say why I think it's so important, why not to go with distributed co-governance architecture or create some new digital common architecture with loose coordination with the United Nations. I think that IGF has big pluses. First of all, IGF is already connected to the United Nations. And I think that when we talk about the future of the internet, we have to do it in the context of the United Nations. I'm not naive. I've been in the United Nations meetings and I know about the digital divide that exists there. And unfortunately, the digital divide is even growing. But there are some things that we have to discuss in that fora, knowing that it will be difficult to agree on something very specific and it will be difficult to agree on something new. But just to reiterate, and it's mainly capacity building, it's mainly confidence building, it's mainly education and awareness raising. So UN as a platform is absolutely unique. And UN as a platform is also unique for multi-stakeholder models. And this brings me to the second point why IGF is so good. IGF is already established forum. It is supported by civil society. It is supported by other stakeholders. Yes, I know that governments and private sector are maybe not too keen to participate in the discussions in the IGF or to be there. I have to be honest, when I was foreign minister, I just stopped there for a high-level panel and left immediately. When I was member of European Parliament, I took time and I went to different meetings and I listened to different discussions, to different stakeholders. So my advice to governments is to take time to go there and to stay longer, to have the chance to discuss and talk to other stakeholders. And that's a big plus, that it's established, stakeholders are there, and we just need now more enthusiasm from the government side. I also think that the gender balance is very good always in IGF. And I also recognize very much the work that IGF is doing with young people. There are 114 national, regional, and youth IGOs, which is a big thing, because usually we do not want to include young people because we know how to run everything, but we have to learn and we have to start listening to them. Yes, there are also some shortcomings, like decision-making process, like lack of actionable outcomes, even I would say that not so active participation yet from the developing countries. But I think that with these shortcomings, IGF and IGF Plus should become the forum where we come together to discuss future of the internet. If we want to have concrete steps forward, yes, there are other forums. And here I'm looking more towards regional forums like the EU, like NATO. I very much hope that at some point we will have also a group of like-minded states, not only EU, NATO, much wider, like-minded, open club with those who agree and share the same values, including applicability of international law, including applicability of human rights to online. So that is the reason why I become always very passionate about the future of the IGF and the internet discussions. And that's why I'm really proud to lead the EP delegation. EP delegation will participate in a parliamentary track, which is a relatively new thing, first introduced in Berlin 2 years ago. I think Berlin was the first time. And I think it's, again, very important, because if we want to have good laws, we need informed politicians. My experience in the European Parliament shows that not all members of the European Parliament feel comfortable with digital topics. There are many stereotypes, there are different reasons for that, but we have to talk also to parliamentarians. We have to talk to those who are drafting laws, who are writing laws, who are negotiating laws, especially today, when EU is going through not only the Green Deal, but also the digital development. So I'm looking forward to the parliamentary discussions, And I hope that Parliament will be also part of the stakeholders for the same way as we see their governments, private sector, civil society, and academia. So 4+1 is the minimum. Plus, of course, IT community, which should be there and which we should listen to. And now my very final remark. I came from London a couple of days ago, where I was chairing the meeting of G7, G20 plus ministers. And I was also very vocal there about IGF. And I have to say that my feeling is, maybe it's my very subjective feeling, that ministers and governments are listening to it. So I think that there is today more enthusiasm about IGF if compared to like it was even 3, 4, 5 years ago. So we have to work more with governments. We have to convince them to come to the table. And in that case, I see that the future of the IGF can be really good and bright, and we will all can work and be committed to the future of the internet. But I'm so happy to see such a list of panelists, and many of whom are already faces we know each other for years. So miss seeing you in person, but thank you so much for joining, and I'll be so happy to listen what your contributions are and participate in the later discussion. Thank you, Maria Rosa.
Thank you very much, Marina, for your introduction and for sharing your thoughts and your passion about IGF. Pearse, Odune, with your King Commission.
Thank you, Maria. And yes, thank you, Marina. A very tough act to follow. And thank you for your leadership as the head of the EP delegation, but also in pulling governments and ministers along and encouraging their interest as well, which is an important dimension of what we want to talk about today. So let me just reflect a bit on that. As we come to the annual meeting, we can reflect on the implementation of the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. And the European Commission has been quite active on that ever since, in fact, the Secretary General's high-level panel on which Marina was playing such an important part. And we're very, very grateful for that. And it helped to shape the consensus around IGF+, which we're now seeing implemented. I think, quite honestly, we can point already to improvements with regard to how the IGF is being viewed as well as it's being prepared and viewed by the stakeholders over the last year. Now, that's partly in response to the roadmap. Section 93 called for an increase in the inclusiveness of the IGF. And we do again have to look back to our German colleagues, that they made a huge effort to try and increase that inclusiveness and scope of representation. But also we're called on to improve the responsiveness of the IGF, and particularly its relevance to current digital issues. And I think that's a virtuous circle, because as we make it more relevant to current digital issues, online abuse, DNS abuse, access, the digital divide, the ability to either undermine or to support diversity and inclusion, all of which are very real issues at a global level. If the IGF really tackles those issues, we will see, by definition, a greater participation, a greater interest. Okay, well, I was just saying that there have been developments that we can look to with a positive attitude, but which now we mustn't be naive, but we must actually live up to the expectations that we have created. First of all, that we, in participating in the MAG strategy group, in particular, the reflection of the implementation of the roadmap, we see that there are, as Marina has also pointed to, some problems still with regard to relevance, but also to getting all of the stakeholders involved. And then there have been various consultations and exchanges on the implementation of IGF+. And here, particularly in something that was originally called the high-level board, but which is now being called the Igf Leadership Panel, we did have some frank and difficult discussions on that, but it showed that everybody was willing to work towards a common vision. Now, the call for membership ended a few days ago, and we look forward to the constitution of the panel. And we think that it can have a real value in the process, as long as it develops a complementary and a collaborative relationship with the MAG. And that for us has been critical. It has to operate in full transparency, but it does and can raise the visibility and the relevance of the topics discussed in the IGF. So we want that to be complementary, to be transparent and supportive, rather than an alternative, because that could, at worst, play into the hands of some United Nations member countries who are not fans of the multi-stakeholder approach at all, something which we hold very dear. It has to be very important to bear in mind that the bottom-up and informal nature of the IGF is one of the things that ensures inclusiveness. And a very procedural-oriented governmental type of organization, which is somewhat inevitable, even in the Commission, but certainly in the UN and in governmental organizations, that will alienate many of the important participants in the multi-stakeholder community. Another element which works alongside the leadership panel is the Tech Envoy office, which again we feel has the potential to implement successfully the roadmap and to contribute greatly to our objectives, but also to form a bridge between the governmental process in the United Nations and the wider multi-stakeholder process in the IGF. The Tech Envoy, it's not a traditional envoy, and it needs to embrace the multi-stakeholder model. And we really hope that it will be able to, after some starting problems, really launch itself effectively from early next year. Now, its success depends on its capacity to enable multi-stakeholder networks and to link the different actions of the multi-stakeholder role in the digital roadmap. Human rights is one area, but also we have to think about connectivity, inclusion, digital public goods, as well as the introduction of artificial intelligence, as all those issues which are high on the agenda, but which have particular relevance and pose particular challenges, for example, for developing countries. Now, when we link an old-fashioned theme, such as I used to work on, connectivity, with human rights, then we are using new paths in order to meet some of the key objectives of the United Nations, of the European Union in our treaty, but also in helping to provide access to an internet that is free and open and not just available to the well-off countries or populations of the world. And by doing that, if we actively play a role there, we can ensure that it remains an open internet, a free internet, and one that can help to spread knowledge, spread prosperity, but also can become a point of access for us to the diverse cultures and the rich heritage of so many other countries in the world. So I'll just conclude on that, just a couple of remarks on what Marina said, particularly about the parliamentary track, which is one of the recent innovations which we very much welcome. A structured approach to that is a way of ensuring that we have input, not just, of course, from the European Parliament, but from parliamentarians across the world. But it also changes the experience that parliamentarians have. They see and can see how the multi-stakeholder model works, and they can also contribute to tangible outcomes from the IGF, and that's very important as well. And then, of course, I do hope that we have a successful meeting next week. I know that the COVID crisis has once again created huge challenges. So if it is online or on site, I hope that everyone here will actively participate and also bring in their communities to participate in what needs to be and shall be, I think, a very important IGF next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pearse, for sharing your views and also touching upon many of the challenges of IGF. Now we'll listen to Sandra Hoferichter with EuroDIG.
Thank you very much, Marina Rosa. Thank you very much, all the participants, and thank you for inviting me again to this debate, which is actually a direct follow-up from the IGF 2020 debriefing that we had in February this year. There we discussed already the IGF Plus model and why it is important to involve parliamentarians as a critical group, just for instance. European stakeholders contributed during the past 2 years in particular to those two focus areas that have been mentioned already, as they are suggested in the UN roadmap. The one is the paragraph 93A, where in particular the first recommendation of a strategic, empowered, multi-stakeholder, high-level body is suggested, and the paragraph 93C, the establishment of a high-level segment and ministerial parliamentarians track, ensuring more actionable outcomes. On the latter, the involvement of parliamentarians has made significant progress this year, and I would just like to summarize this a little bit. For instance, a member of an Italian parliament became a member of the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, the MEP, and that was never been the case before. We see a growing number of attendees from parliamentarians in the UN IGF, and I just got the number from today. At the moment, 99 registrations for online and on-site participation are registered. And a parliamentarians track has been established in the entire Internet governance fora, the global IGF as well as the regional and the national IGFs. And I saw that one participant posted the link to the parliamentarians track website of the IGF already. And what I would like to do is also share my screen with you, where you can basically have a look on all the activities in detail as they are planned at the IGF. I think it's quite worth visiting that page, because you will also find a lot of inside information on the page, conceptual notes, what they are discussing, and so on and so forth. At EuroDIG, we were a little bit unfortunate this year with the timing, because we had our meeting late in June, and this was just too close to the summer break in order to involve parliamentarians to a great extent. But we had always parliamentarians participating, so I think that can be improved, and we can make progress here as well. The parliamentarians track of the IGF this year went a little bit further. They introduced, and this is also new for all participants, not only for parliamentarians, they introduced a preparatory and engagement phase starting already in September and lasting basically until the beginning of the IGF, until November. And for parliamentarians in particular, these sessions were served to become familiar with the IGF and the broader internet governance ecosystem, as well as to discuss certain key topics such as data, content policy, or artificial intelligence governance. During the IGF, the discussion on these key issues will continue, and a round table will be built around the outcomes of the discussion on these three topics. And this is really something I'm very curious on, what is the outcome of these sessions, because that was a main issue, that actionable outcome is basically one of the weaknesses of the IGF so far. Then the other part is the paragraph 93.8, and Pearse already basically mentioned many of the things that I would also like to share with you, because I think these reflect what I would call a European stakeholder view. We organized a EuroDIG extra session in March this year, and I also put in the chat the link to this extra session where you can find the recording and all the detailed information behind it, to discuss in particular the multi-stakeholder high-level body, as it was called at that time. We had around 40 participants participating, and the discussion was very engaging and was summarized in 2 short paragraphs. One on the functioning of the relationship and one on the relationship to the mark. Our aim was to become a shared view from participants and to make a joint submission to the IGF consultation process, as we did finally. On the functions of the new body, there was broad support of the rationale of creating such a body, and but none of the MHLB bodies at that time, was it called, should draw the attention away from the IGF to undermine its bottom-up and multi-stakeholder nature. And one of the most important functions of this body was seen to bridge the gap between the discussion and the decision. And this is basically also what the parliamentarians' involvement aims for, that we really need to bring together the level of the discussions and the level of the decisions. And sometimes it is just not very visible how this can be achieved, because people going away from an IGF session with a lot of input, you cannot really measure how this is included in legislation, in the daily work, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to be a little bit more graceful with what we call outcomes, because you cannot really measure what people are doing that going away from the IGF with their certain takeaways. And then on the relation to the Mark, there was general agreement on the need for such a body and to have a strong linkage with the Mark rather than being a separate body. Now the call for nominations, and now I switch to that new term, which is now called the Leadership Panel, was just finished this Monday, and I will be curious in particular how many nominations have been received in this one. I personally think the term leadership panel is a little bit unfortunate, because it could suggest a top-down approach, a superior authority overseeing the secretariat and the market. This is definitely something that we should avoid, and that was one of the outcomes of all these consultations that we made, that it should rather be describing and more strategic and coordinating role. That was what was largely accepted, and the term leadership panel is possibly not the best role. I'm not sure, maybe Yuping will let us know if this is still under discussion and can be changed. We will see. In any case, we believe the establishment of such a body is a major step forward to the IGF Plus model, and this group will really have to meet very high standards, and it will be a great opportunity to consolidate the role of the IGF in the future. And I stop here and look forward to the update from Yuping.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So then over to Yuping Chan with the United Nations.
Thank you so much. And a lot of questions, and I'm not sure I'll be able to get to all of them, but let me try the best I can. Let me start by saying that we at the UN side, we recognize that more has to be done. And that this is part of why throughout the last few years, as Marina has mentioned, starting with the high-level panel, we've really been renewing our work around digitals as part of a process of multi-stakeholder consultation and partnership. So that led, for instance, the roadmap for digital cooperation. And we do really think that it has galvanized UN action and partnership on key themes such as global connectivity, digital human rights, digital inclusion. And we've been particularly grateful for Europe's support for the panel and then the roadmap and the underlying vision that the United Nations shares with Europe on an open, free, and secure digital future for all. Governments, European governments are strong proponents of the roadmap at the UN. Stakeholders from satellite providers, civil society institutions, EuroDIG, for instance, satellite technology companies, they're all very active in the activities to implement the roadmap and are working with us and our partner UN agencies. So that process of that multi-stakeholder partnership will continue. And that is part of why in his recent report on our common agenda, the Secretary General is now proposing a global digital compact to translate the roadmap into a shared agreement, an understanding not just among governments, but also multi-stakeholders, the private sector, civil society, other stakeholders around these common principles, open, free, and secure, because this is what we want in our collective digital future. But part of the problem, and I think some other colleagues also alluded to this, is that in the current international climate, it is very difficult to achieve even small things here at the UN, much less a compact of this nature, and then a multi-stakeholder compact to add to the issues around the table. But then in this technological digital sphere, we do need this coming together precisely because we're seeing new areas of fracture and geopolitical clashes. And that's where we think the IGF, working with the UN, Europe, must play critical roles in bringing together what is already a very fragmented space. And I think this is also part of what Pearse was saying about how the IGF can better address ongoing challenges and issues in parts of the evolution to becoming an IGF+. So for instance, the United Nations is particularly concerned over the issue of internet fragmentation, the breaking down of the global interoperable internet into distinct separate spheres. This is specifically mentioned in the common agenda as a focus for the digital compact. And this is something that we are seeing today with new technical legislative policy developments, techno protectionist initiatives, and even the creation of new sort of alliances or gatherings of like-minded countries. And I think this issue of internet fragmentation is something that is an urgent concern of stakeholders in the IGF community who live and breathe around the vision of an open and free internet. So that's an area where I do think that there will need to be greater focus in the coming years, particularly as we work towards the digital compact. Secondly, I think Europe has demonstrated a lot of strength and leadership in deliberating internally and bridging different cultures, interests, and priorities and viewpoints to reach a harmonized position in the region. And you've staked out leadership on issues related to digital technologies, data protection, now the ongoing discussions on AI, for instance. So there are important lessons and best practices and insights to be gained from Europe, both in terms of what you've eventually decided on, but also the process of getting there. So I do think, again, this is something where there really is a valuable contribution that the IGF and European actors can play. And thirdly, and I won't go too much into this because it's really been elaborated at length by Marina when she explained why this is not in the DNA of the UN, the multi-stakeholder model, which we here do take for granted, but really it has been a struggle even getting this through in the UN processes. And then I think colleagues might also be aware that with the common agenda, for instance, this is recurring as a potential flashpoint. And so particularly in this digital sphere where multi-stakeholderism is so critical, I think we will really need to guard it and to really advocate for it very strongly in the years to come. But in order for all this to happen, what we really need is for the IGF to retain its bottom-up stakeholder, multi-stakeholder nature, but also having its ability to transmit its powerful messages outwards. These messages about openness, freedom, protection, and rights, we need to amplify the discussions that happen at the IGF and the voices of all its various regional, national youth components as well. And this is partly why we've established the Igf Leadership Panel, because we believe deeply in the value of the IGF, and we want to make sure that it takes its rightful place globally. When today, unlike 15 years ago, when it was first started, there were not so many actually international forums and convenings in digital. But right now, these are competing for attention and space. And it is, I think, as colleagues would admit, where a lot of the political attention and leadership and discussion and airspace is being taken up. So for instance, the fact that we have come now to the IGF Leadership Panel, I am also sorry, Sandra, I do think the name is a little bit fixed and I don't think there will be scope to discuss it further. And in fact, this was actually based on feedback that we had gotten from some of the stakeholders that we should have this particular sort of name and nomenclature for it. It has been established precisely so that we can elevate the IGF discussions and give it that kind of buzz, the kind of relevance, the visibility that it deserves. And we're deeply aware of the issues around it. I think, again, these have been mentioned by Pearse, and Sandra's mentioned some of these as well. And we are really committed to working closely with everyone to make sure that it achieves what we are collectively striving to do for the IGF itself. And it's precisely because we value IGF as a living, breathing model of multi-stakeholderism, but now with added income and relevance, that we also want it to serve as a critical building block towards the UN's work towards a global digital compact. So we're hoping to count on the IGF community, its network of NRIs, to contribute views and inputs on what you want to see in the compact, and perhaps maybe just tossing out an idea to see what role the stakeholders can then play in holding governments and tech companies accountable for what is actually agreed in the compact, because we do recognize that this is a collective endeavor, and we do see a very important role for the IGF to actually play in all of this. I think I'll end by sort of briefly mentioning the Tech Envoy office, because it's where I work, and I know it's a subject of much interest from everyone. It's not been the easiest time for us this year. And it's also complicated by the fact that the issues we work on are hardly the simplest one around, and there are so much politics around. But we think that despite all of this, throughout this year, we've demonstrated our value as an office and the need for such an office and a tech envoy role in the UN system. And so we really do thank you for your faith in us, and please rest assured that we will try our best to live up to the expectations for us and for the office itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yunping. A very strong message you have shared, indeed, very, very positive as well, after all. We will now finish the round of contributions from our panelists with ETNO, Maarit Palovirta, representing, so let's say, the point of view of the industry and this panel.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Marina and the EIF team, for having invited us to this discussion. And I would just like to start by saying that it's really good to see that, to witness still all the continued passion and the conviction on the IGF, even with these difficult circumstances that that we've been all facing in the last year or two, because it's easy for all of us, especially who are not maybe on the driving seat, to lose a little bit the contact with the IGF and the internet governance discussions. And so I'll be talking on behalf of the private sector, but also I think as kind of keen IGF goers from our side. So we haven't been really in a position to set the agenda for the IGF, and we're trying to contribute. We're a small, medium-sized organization, but really the value of the IGF for us is to go there to share our views on the different digital policy issues, to hear other people's views, of course, to do the networking and so forth. So, you know, slightly different perspective to perhaps the previous speakers. Now, the multi-stakeholder model and open internet, I mean, is still very much what we believe in at ETNO. And of course, we have all witnessed that in the last year or two, there have been some perceived threats to these models that we all believe in. And I think that from our point of view, it's very important that in a European context, we have a kind of a common front to face these issues and to discuss these issues openly, and also then to see how we can open these discussions at the global level. So, and from our point of view, of course, the IGF is a key platform for that. Some discussions are, of course, happening at the intergovernmental level, at the ITU, etc. But from our point of view, IGF is still a very valuable platform for that. And we have been actually in the process of the reform, so to speak. So we have been very firmly supporting also the IGF Plus model, so to try and see what we can do with the current IGF and to improve that. I will give you some initial comments from our side on the UN roadmap for digital cooperation. So this is, of course, something that we welcome in the effort to try and strengthen the internet governance structures at a global level. And you know, we haven't actually put forward any very concrete thoughts on this, but I think that initial reflection on this would be still useful from our side. And we already heard that there's been quite a lot of movement in the internet governance structures on global level, and this can be, from our point of view, a little bit confusing. So you already mentioned the previous speakers mentioned the UN Tech Envoy's office. We think that, as it was already mentioned, there's great promise, and certainly this could be a very valuable body to make sure that we deal with the digital issues in an effective way. But we still don't quite understand how this will contribute to the discussions. Similarly, of course, the new IGF Leadership Panel that was already discussed. Again, there's great promise, and we hope that it will be a body where we can add value and also where we can convey some of the European messages from our side that I think that many of us share. But it's very important that indeed this doesn't then overcomplicate things and perhaps even fragment the discussions around the IGF. So we already have the MAG and many other things. So we need to make sure that we are then aligned and we are actually making the decision making and the discussions more effective at all levels. On the content of the roadmap, I mean, I think many of the issues are very much in line with the European policy agenda: connectivity, human institutional capacity, human rights, trust, security. These are all the issues that we very much believe in. And I think in Europe, we are quite advanced in many of these issues. And it's also then very relevant, of course, that we reflect the same issues in the global sphere. On the digital cooperation beyond the different bodies, I think that indeed the agenda could be perhaps a little bit more focused. So we often see very high level themes for the IGF. Of course, we need to bear in mind that everybody globally should have topics that are relevant, but it would be also good to then, you know, we heard topics such as the AI, many different things, to reflect some of the more up and coming topics from our point of view, so that we also have the relevance at the regional level. On the different programs on the ministerial level and parliamentary level, I think that's a very interesting idea. And it's also something that, of course, Sandra has been working on at the European level at the EuroDIG. it is something that can make and has made actually the IGF and also the EuroDIG more attractive in a way to private sector, because it of course enhances the networking opportunity. What would be very important though is to make sure that we're not somehow then compromising the democratic structure of the IGF though, because it is very of course easy to have high-level people on separate tracks, different discussion, closed doors discussions, and as Marina said in the beginning, and then perhaps without the actual opportunity for other stakeholders to have proper discussions and detailed discussions with these individuals. So I think that's been actually nice. Some of the nice things about the IGF, that you can in the corridors meet all levels of people, whether it's the civil society, etc., and have rather informal discussions with these individuals. On the outcomes and recommendations, we have been a bit cautious about that in the private sector. So we have a lot of policy work ongoing in Europe and a very heavy agenda. And, you know, in terms of discussing whether there should be recommendations or concrete outcomes, we're also always a little bit hesitant, because we wouldn't want to have any global, very concrete policy recommendations that might conflict with our regional policy framework, or indeed overcomplicate things from our perspective. So there is of course value to do some intersessional policy work, but I think that, you know, that should be then also considered vis-a-vis the resources available. So for organizations, for example, like ourselves, it would be quite difficult potentially to dedicate resource on the intersessional work, especially as we have, of course, then in parallel policy work going on at the European level. We have been as ETNO a sponsor at the EuroDIG for a long time. We also sponsored the IGF last year. So we really want to make sure that it's visible and clear that we do support the agenda also from the telecom sector's point of view. So I think that, you know, overall there are good ingredients to improve the IGF, but we really need to make sure that, you know, they're not only good on the paper, but also then that the execution and the operations will be smooth and easy for stakeholders, let's say normal stakeholders like us, to navigate. Of course, as ETNO, I mean, we want to be part of the common European, let's say, front for internet governance, and we want to play an active role there. And I think we are already doing that within our resources. So that's something that we want to continue. And yes, very happy to continue the discussions here today. Thank you.